Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I am sharing with you a variety of ideas you can use for your opening activities. Opening activities for us can last anywhere from a half an hour to even an hour or more. They tend to be really short activities or lessons that start our day or start our lessons before we get to the main lesson of the day. So since we follow a Waldorf approach, we do have a main lesson of the day. It usually takes around 2 hours. And to begin those lessons, we start with some opening activities. For me, it's a way to invite the children into this learning space. It's a way to engage my children, and especially when my children were younger and they were engaged in a lot of other activities like play and creative endeavors and open-ended activities. This was a way to gently move them from one task to another. And usually I would start with something that was sort of piqued their curiosity. So I might start by reading aloud from a book, and that would just gently move them from a task that they were really engaged in to sort of being like, oh, what's going on over here? And then we could gently move into our opening activities, and then we could gently move into our main lesson of the day. I have activities here. I've got options for young children as well as older children, depending on your child's grade level and their interest level. I'm sure that you'll find something that can work for you and your family for your opening activities. So I'm going to start out with my favorite option for opening activities, and that would be reading aloud. And I love to use picture books for our read alouds. Now, using picture books for young children is not so much a Waldorf principle. You might use storytelling rather than reading from a book, and I do have some options for you if you would prefer to do your own storytelling based on some of these resources, so that you could read ahead and then present that story or those songs or those verses as part of your opening activity. I'm going to start with my favorite opening activity, and that is to read aloud, primarily from illustrated picture books, but you can also read aloud from a chapter book that you are doing a chapter a day of, for instance, or you can use other types of books for your opening activities for reading aloud. Now, reading aloud is not generally a Waldorf principle. You're usually storytelling rather than reading aloud, but these books can be used for you as the teacher parent to familiarize yourself with a particular subject area or a biography, and then you can present that orally if you don't want to read aloud from the picture book. So I have an assortment of picture books here. They're not necessarily my go-to picture books or my favorite picture books. They are an assortment, but you'll be able to find the links to all of these resources on the blog post that accompanies this video. If you do like any of these particular books that I'm sharing with you, you can find links to all of them on the blog post, and you can find the link to the blog post in the description box below. So I like using a variety of picture books for our opening activities, and this is a biography on the girl who named Pluto, the story of Venetia Burney. And what I like about picture books, especially biographies or other ones that are historically geared, or maybe they are scientific or mathematical, is that you are now having the option to present a variety of subject areas that are short lessons to complement your one main lesson, which would be a good 2 hours of the day. And so by using a variety of subject areas for your picture books, you're actually able to do what I'm going to call a little bit of a Charlotte Mason approach, by doing many lessons that are very short before the child has the time to get tired of that lesson or overstimulated or have too much information about it. You're just doing a really short lesson. And I feel like this is the best of both worlds if you want to sort of maintain a little bit of that Charlotte Mason approach while still doing a Waldorf approach. I feel like utilizing picture books or other activities in your opening activities allows you to do that. So this book, I also choose books for their illustrations, and I did like the illustrations for this one. Now you can do something that's maybe a little bit more heartwarming or heart-touching, and the Map of Good Memories is one of these books. And so you can also, so this book is about a child who has to leave their home or their country. And so she's in her mind imagining all of these places that she used to go to or frequent, or her home or the park, and all of these things. She's making a map of good memories for herself. So I find that the quality of picture books now is amazing, and the variety is even more amazing. So you can also choose picture books that can help your students if they are either going through a challenging time, or you're anticipating something coming up, or to help them be able to relate to other students who might have had a difficult time in their life. Either they've lost a loved one, or they've had to move from their family home or from their country and they're refugees. So having some picture books that help you with the dialogue and help you with having a little bit more empathy for other people who are going through that, I think is a really great option for your opening activities. And then it takes your opening activities to another level, because the amount of information, education, and experience that you're getting from these kinds of books, this high quality kind of book, is going to be sometimes even better than a main lesson itself. So this is the Map of Good Memories. If you have an older student, you might consider doing something like the Who Was series. So these books, I would say I'd put them at about middle elementary. So a student who's already learned how to read pretty proficiently, but the quality of these books is very simple. So I find them really good even for adults. If you want a quick refresher on a biography or any other subject area that this series has, I find this book to be really great because you can read it very quickly. It has more information than you would get from a picture book, and it allows a student who's a little bit more advanced, or you want them to practice their reading skills, to do something that also has value within your opening activities, because that student could then present that information, or you could read this aloud for your students. It would be potentially a little bit longer than a picture book, depending. Some of the picture books I have do take about 10 to 15 minutes to read. But you could do a chapter a day as part of your opening activities. And again, you would be able to get a broad assortment of subject areas that you're doing a little bit every day in your opening activities. You could also do other picture books for biographies or for subject areas that are more broad than what you're doing. So I love including math picture books whenever possible. This is The Boy Who Loved Math, The Improbable Life of Paul Erdős. And I really, really love this book so much. I think that if anything, it allows you to appreciate the genius of some mathematicians or scientists or artists who may have social skills that are a little bit atypical. And I feel like this book has done a brilliant job in accepting those differences of this brilliant mathematician and explain how the rest of his community and friends compensated, or in a loving way, compensated for some of the things that he was unable to do, because he was able to do fantastic things, and yet some of his, what we would call very basic social skills, were maybe not as developed or proficient as maybe the general population. So I really loved this book. We included this in our math units, but what I love about opening activities is that you can introduce books or concepts or subject areas that are a preview of some lessons to come, or you can just complement your main lesson block with material in your opening activities that coordinates with your main lesson subject, or you can use a book like this long after your subject or your main lesson block is over as a way to remind the student or refresh on some of the ideas that you've previously learned. In addition to math picture books, you can also get other biographies that are historical. This is a new edition for our homeschool. This is called One Wish, Fatima al-Fihri, the world's oldest university. This is a very beautifully illustrated picture book that also is historical, and it talks about the very first university. And so this is something that is not just close to my heart because it's about a female in history, which I love to include as many as possible female role models, not just for my daughter, but for my sons as well. But also it talks about the first university. And so education, of course, as a homeschooler is something that's close to my heart. And so learning about this and being able to present this in our homeschool was also very important. So another option for your opening activities is something historical when it comes to picture books. But you don't have to do something that's academic at all. You can do something that's seasonal. And so I have Winter is Coming as a seasonal option. This is another really beautifully illustrated picture book that my children really loved. And a picture book like this is not one that we would just read one time throughout like our opening, or like say for a main lesson block. This is not a book that I would read one time. This is a book that I would read like say every day for like 2 weeks along with other books, especially for younger students, because they like that kind of repetition. It may get a little bit tedious for us as a teacher, as a parent, but for the younger children, they really love that kind of repetition. And a book like this is perfect for all of fall because you're looking at fall illustrations in preparation for winter. So this would be really great for anywhere from like say September to November, even into December, depending on where you live. Or if you live in the southern hemisphere, then you're looking at other months, but you're looking at a time period where this is a seasonal book. So this is not a book that I would pull out like in the spring, for instance. It just wouldn't have the right kinds of vibes, but it's something that I would read multiple times in one season, especially if I had young children. And to be honest, even if you have older children, I found that my middle schoolers loved books like this as long as I was reading them to younger students. But when I just have a middle schooler or an older student, they're not as willing to do something that seems very childish. But I did notice that when my children were just about hitting puberty, there was this desire to revisit a lot of the things they used to do when they were younger. There was a lot of reminiscing, a lot of grieving. They didn't know it was grieving, but a lot of grieving this change that is occurring, and this cognitive understanding that their childhood, that part of their childhood has come to an end, and the things that they used to enjoy, they don't enjoy in the same way. And there's this longing to try to recapture that just one more time before they completely move into young adulthood and puberty and all the changes that come about with that. So you might consider pulling out some of these nostalgic picture books, even if you only have a middle schooler. And you might be like, I just want to read it for myself, and they would really enjoy it as well. If you lived here, Houses of the World is a great option if you are doing a shelters block for say grade 3. We've used this for that block itself, but I think that it makes a really wonderful opening activity book because you're now getting to explore shelters from around the world. And so I find like a book like this to be really informative. It's a dense book when it comes to how rich it is. I should say a rich book rather than a dense book, because you're getting, of course, these illustrations aren't quite the kind that I like, but you may love these kinds of illustrations. So you're getting rich illustrations, you're getting content that also is rich in the sense that you're learning about shelters from around the world. And I actually really like this additional part that they have for these books where it has like the house type, the materials, the location, date, and fascinating facts. I actually really like that little extra tidbit of information. When I'm reading a book like this for younger students, I would skip all of these parts. This would be something that I would read to myself silently or just kind of browse it as they're looking at the illustrations. If I was doing this with older students, I might read some of these things aloud, but primarily for younger students, I would just be reading more of the narrative part because that kind of keeps the flow with the book. And if they were curious, I certainly would add a few additional bits of information if they wanted to know. So if you have just older children, but you still love the idea of an illustrated picture book, I will suggest the Welcome to the Museum series because these illustrations are fabulous. I love them so much. The only book that I'm not as crazy about the illustrations for is the anatomy one, and so I would caution you reading that one as part of your opening activities, especially if you have younger students. But as far as an opening activity book, what I love about including these books is that for us, especially as we're winding down our homeschool journey, there are some units that we're not going to be visiting again, or with my one child, we never visited them. Like we never did an ocean. Actually, she was very young when we did our ocean main lesson block, but we don't have any ocean main lesson block coming up. So what I love about including a book like this is that we can do somewhat of an ocean main lesson block, not really, but somewhat of one, in our opening activities by reading 2 pages every day before we start our other lessons. Now, the difference is that this isn't going to follow the Waldorf pedagogy if you're doing a Waldorf main lesson block. If you're not, then it's completely okay. You can view it a little bit more like a unit study. And the other thing is that we're not going to be doing any main lesson book work. So she's not going to be doing a written narration or even an oral narration as far as a review. And we're not going to be doing any illustrations. We're not going to be doing any handwork projects or any activities, anything that's hands-on. We're not intending to do any of that when we are doing an opening activity. If we're doing a handwork project, then it's for the handwork project nature of it, rather than trying to coordinate with any of the other books that we're reading. So I love including these as part of our opening activities because I found that, especially with this series, the Welcome to the Museum series, that the content that's included is a little bit more sparse. It's not quite as rich as some of the other materials that I would use in order to actually put together a lesson for a main lesson block. However, as an opening activity, it's just the right amount of information. So I'm really pleased. I have several of this series in our homeschool. The illustrations are absolutely captivating. I use them a lot for our main lesson book work when we're using these books with our main lessons. Otherwise, the written portion is just enough so that you're not tired before you can move on. It's just enough information for an opening activity. In my opinion, it's not quite enough for a main lesson, but you might feel like this is just enough for your main lessons, and then your books can double for both. But if you're looking to still include the vibe of a picture book, but you have older students, this is the way to go. If picture books are not your thing and you want to storytell instead, I have a few resources for you that you can use to help you in your storytelling for your opening activities. Now, you can also just read these books aloud. This one is Tell Me a Story, and these are stories from all over the world. They are short stories. Some of them they're only a page or 2 long. And what I've done in the past is I've read 1 story a day as part of our opening activities, but you could read this ahead of time and then present the story, which I find to be a more engaging way to present a story. There are different opinions on what is, I'm going to say, better, which is very subjective. The Charlotte Mason approach advises that you don't retell stories, that you read from the original text, because this has been perfected with a professional or someone who's highly skilled in that area, and don't dilute their vocabulary or their concepts by retelling the story. Versus in the Waldorf approach, retelling the story allows you to process the information, digest it, and own it, so that when you're telling it, it really is coming from you rather than having a book separate you and the person listening to the story. Now, over the years, I've done both, but to be honest, because of time, I've mostly relied on reading aloud rather than storytelling. In the moments that I have story told, that I have done storytelling, I have found that it is far more engaging, a lot more enjoyable, and the impact is deeper. But throughout my homeschooling years, there just hasn't been enough time to do that. What I find is that it becomes almost a conversation, especially with our main lessons versus our opening activities, that when I've prepared, it almost becomes a conversation, or almost becomes like I'm so lively and telling my student about the material that I feel like the passion is almost infectious. When you're using stories like this that are much smaller, this would maybe be a 5-minute pre-read, which I understand sometimes we don't even have 5 minutes when we're homeschooling with a lot of young children. But a 5-minute pre-read not only gives you the information to tell a story, but a lot of times I find that you can embellish on your own, or you can be reminded of something from another story that you want to add, or the recall you find, you become better and better at it the more that you do this. So this is a book that you can use either to read aloud or as inspiration for you to come up with the stories to present to your students during your opening activities. History through stories is another option. You can use this for your main lesson for history, but I also found that some of these stories were short enough that I could include them in our opening activities, because I felt like when I finally did include this in our homeschool, it really wasn't what I was looking for our main lesson. And I found that this worked better as an opening activity versus a main lesson, even though this is so rich with information, additional reading, how you can include science, poetry. It's a really brilliant way to do a main lesson or maybe even a unit study approach with the content, which has been well done. It's narrative style, it's engaging with additional ideas in order to enrich the lesson itself. I found that using this as an open activity was just right, because by this point my children were a little bit older. This was a nice review of lessons, and also the way that it's written is a little bit more juvenile than some of the other resources that we use. So you could use this either as your curriculum or as part of your opening activities. And there's also science through stories as well, in case you're interested. The Daliers, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Book of Norwegian Folktales. This is another great opportunity for you to include folktales and legends from around the world. So learning about other people's, their history through the folktales is a great way to become accustomed to the cultures from other parts of the world. So I love that about the Waldorf curriculum, because they spend a long time doing creation stories or folk tales, legends, fairy tales from all around the world, so that you really get an idea and essence of the people from other areas through their beliefs and through their stories. So a book like this would be great as an opening activity, so that you could read this aloud, or again, if you had the time, you could pre-read it. Some of these stories are very short, other ones are long, so you would have to just decide how much time you're willing to give to this particular subject area as part of your opening activities. So far I've already shared a few different examples, and it's not meant that you're doing a little bit of everything every day. It's really meant that you are doing a few of these examples, or you cycle through them, because otherwise your opening activities would literally take the entire day with how much time each of them are taking. So we're looking at just a few minutes, less than 10 minutes for each of these ideas, so that your opening activity can be 30 minutes or so, but definitely less than an hour. I'm guilty of going way over an hour with our opening activities. And by that time, your children are ready for a break. The whole idea of an opening activity is to usher them into the main lesson. But if you spend an hour or more in your opening activities, you've used up their capacity for concentration and learning, and now they're ready for a break and something creative and some playtime. So you want to be mindful of how long your opening activities are. If you're looking for language art resources to use for your opening activities, I have a couple of resources here and a couple of ideas on how you can include spelling or grammar or vocabulary into your opening activities. So the first one is intended for a much older student. This is SAT vocabulary flashcards. And I don't really like using these flashcards as just like, do you know what this word means and can you use it in a sentence? I would rather use the word in a sentence and have them try to define it, because I feel like that's a little bit more true to how you would find a word, like say in a book that you're reading that you haven't seen before. Or I'll say, here's the word, can you use this in a sentence? Because I find it a little bit more challenging to describe a word verbally when you know how you can use it in a sentence, you have a general idea, but you're struggling with the words on how to define it. So I would first ask, can you use this in a sentence? How would you use vent in a sentence, or verbose in a sentence? Or can you spell this word, for instance? How do you spell verbose? So that would be a way that you could include spelling, not just vocabulary. And then afterwards, I would then give the definition, maybe even the part of speech, after I first could see that my child actually knows quite a bit of vocabulary, but struggles to use the correct language to describe it. But then, as they get older, then we can modify this so that they are immediately starting out with a definition if they are really practicing for SATs or they just want to increase their vocabulary. But for younger students, I would say upper elementary and middle school, I would just start by, can you use this in a sentence? Or if I'm using this in a sentence, can you do you know what it means? Even if they can't tell you in so many words, but they just have a sense of what it means, usually that's fine at the beginning. If you want something that's going to be more spelling based, then All About Spelling has the flashcards, which makes it really easy to pull out, say, 10 cards and do like a little spelling bee with the cards. I find that for me personally, doing spelling just in my mind is really hard for me, and I need to write spelling words down. So I've never tested my children extensively when it comes to spelling words that they have to tell me how to spell a word without being able to see it. So spelling is also a visual exercise because you start to memorize the shape of how the word looks. And I am very sensitive to my children learning how to spell a word wrong and not having it be corrected so that they then always default to that incorrect spelling. And the way that this would work, or the way this happened, or happens with me, is that if you write the word wrong, and this is a Charlotte Mason idea, if you write the word wrong, you want to erase that word as quickly as possible and write it correctly so that the student has it ingrained in their mind, the correct spelling and the correct format, the correct shape of that word. So when I'm doing spelling that's going to be, hey, just spell this word for me without seeing it, without writing it down, if my students struggle with that, I want to pull back from that so that they are not learning a bad habit or learning to spell those words incorrectly. I would only do this with words that they had already been exposed to. And then if you can see it in your mind's eye, then you can spell it out verbally. That's great. So doing spelling this way would be something that I would say be very mindful of your children's abilities, because we don't want to create bad habits as we are teaching them. So All About Spelling would be one way to introduce spelling if you're looking for something that's a little bit more academic for your opening activities. However, if you want something that's a little bit more leisure and fun and humorous for your opening activities, you might consider Mad Libs. And I really, really like them quite a bit. Let me find one that's not been used yet, because I might have gone through all of them. All right, so I found one. And what I like about these also is that they give you a blank one here that you can add in so that you can use this multiple times so that you're not writing over all of the words that you already have. So it comes with the story, and then several words in the story are not included. So you have to ask around, like, give me an adjective or a number or the first name of a person. And in this way, you learn very, very quickly the parts of speech. So even if you don't know them all, hopefully at least one person does, you can start to learn the different parts of speech. And I think this is the most enjoyable way. It's so funny in the end. And then, of course, then you read your story in the end, and it's usually really funny and very silly because you've chosen words that maybe don't go with the story, because you shouldn't even, you would know this is stuff about the universe, but you wouldn't know the specific title of the story that you're doing. And then, of course, you can use it multiple times. And so sometimes whoever's in charge will be calling out, like, I need an adjective or a noun, and everyone else is doing them. Or I'll be the one writing it down, and I'll ask my students, I need an adjective or a noun or a number or an adverb. This works great if they've been exposed a little bit to the parts of speech, but you don't need very much, because very quickly you can get nouns and adjectives. For the most part, even young students can understand nouns and adjectives. And if you're working with even younger students, you might ask those students who are very young, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, to say, give me a number or the name of a person. Those ones they can definitely do. Or when you're doing nouns, you might say, can you name me an object in this room? So even if they don't know noun yet, if they're naming you an object in the room, that's a noun, and then you can include that so that even your younger students can participate in this game. A few years ago, my daughter gifted me a deck of mushrooms, and it's so beautiful. I love it so much, but it's not getting used in our homeschool, even when we did our unit or our main lesson block in botany, which included several lessons on fungus and mushrooms. So this is another opportunity for you to use some of these things that you might have that you're like, I don't know how to fit that into our homeschool. I'm not doing a unit on this. And even if I was, like we were, how do you actually incorporate something that's this beautiful, these beautiful, almost like flashcards that have these illustrations on the front and then some information on the back? Well, opening activities might be the place that you can include this. So this would be really fun to do, like say for a week, choosing a different mushroom every day, reading a little bit about it, and then on the next day, you can actually just do a little quiz. Like, do you remember the one that we did, the indigo milk cap? Can you tell me something about it? So that it feels like within this week, you did this little mini unit on mushrooms that only took a few minutes every day, because reading this might take 5 minutes, and then you still are getting a little bit of information, education in a very beautiful manner, just a little bit every day. But I wouldn't do this every day for the entire season or year. This would be something that I would use more sparingly. Like I would do mental math, and we do mental math every day, but I wouldn't do something like this every day. This would be something that's a little bit different. Let's shake things up and do something that we haven't done before or that we don't do often. I have a couple of decks of cards here. Each of them are a little bit different, and I find them to be another great opening activity project. So for the decks, the How to Be a Wildflower deck is the one that's probably the most open-ended, because number one, they have beautiful illustrations. I absolutely love the illustrations. And then they have little quotes or words that are engaging. Let me take out the one that tells you about the deck. So for instance, you were born with wings. You are a rare find. Nourish your soul. Welcome change. So these are less to discuss and more to contemplate. I love having these quotes as something that can sort of just hang in the air during our main lesson, and something that we can contemplate as we're working through our main lesson. And I love the illustrations. They're just so beautiful. Now I have a couple other decks here that I think work better for older students, so middle school and above. So I have talking points. This is the family edition, and this is going to have different categories of questions. For instance, if you could make a brand new subject at school, what would it be? Pick one fruit to combine with one vegetable to make a fruitable. And so these are just fun questions that you can ask your child or your students in order just to get like a conversation going. This one is not my favorite set, however. I do like this religious set, but this one is really great for high school students. So I wouldn't necessarily use this with young students. This one has 3 different categories: deep, personal, and fun and light. And so you can choose how in depth you want to go with your questions. This is a great conversation starter, but this is really great for older students. So if you've got, say, upper middle school or even young high school, and you're looking for a way to have an opening activity that doesn't seem so youthful, this might be a really great option, because you get a really good discussion going. And I really like the questions that are in this particular set. So it has 150 prompts. It's called Towards Faith, and it's a reflection deck. So this is a religious option if you're looking for something that's maybe less or that's just different from some of the other options that you can find. The family deck is one that's just very generic, just not my favorite though. And then if you are looking for something that's a little bit more insightful and somewhat reflective from an emotional perspective or from a personality perspective, the self-compassion deck might be one that you can use too. Again, I would suggest these for older students. This question, for instance, is: can you take a moment to recall the last time you laughed? Can you watch a funny video now or otherwise make yourself smile? So a lot more in-depth, introspective, and I would not use these for younger students. I would use these for older students, so middle school and higher. I have a couple of resources, some religious and some that are Waldorf inspired for opening activities that are verse or poetry based. So the Waldorf Book of Animal Poetry, this has so many poems for all different kinds of animals. You could use this for your zoology block, or you could use this when the children are very young. I like this because we primarily use this for our ocean main lesson block, but it gives you such a variety of poems that you could introduce one daily for a week until that poem was memorized, or do one every day that's different. I prefer when the children are much younger to do something repetitive over the course of a week or 2 weeks before moving on to something else. There's also a journey through time in verse and rhyme, and this one will have verses. Here it has some tongue twisters. It has poetry. This is quite versatile, covering many different subject areas. This is such a treasure if you're looking for something not just for your main lesson blocks, but also for your opening activities. When the children are much younger, I find that the opening activities is a great time to bring something to the table that is going to be discussed later in a fun way. So memorizing poetry or tongue twisters in your opening activities makes it a really fun, engaging way to then introduce the subject, your main lesson block, a little bit later. My opening activities that I have don't always relate to the main lesson block, but when they do, it's a great time to be very focused with the activity that you want to do for your opening activities. And this book is one of those resources that would really help you choose the poetry, or choose like a tongue twister or something else, a verse for instance, that can really direct your students to your main lesson. And again, for something like this, I would do this repetitively over the course of a week or 2 weeks or even 3 weeks while we're doing that particular main lesson. If you want a religious resource instead, the Accepted Whispers are a set of dua or prayers that you can read. I believe they are set up for like daily, like for the days of the week. That's not something that we do. It's just the way that this book is organized. And so if you wanted to, you could always read the Monday duas on Monday and the Tuesday duas on Tuesday, and that way you just have some regularity in the ones that you are reciting or sharing with your students. And then the Most Beautiful Names of Allah. This is a book that goes through the 99 names of Allah, and this is a great opening activity if you want to include something religious. And you don't have to be Muslim to include this specifically. This is also a great way to expose your students to other religions and other cultures. And this goes through all the names of Allah. It explains where they are in the Quran, the verse that it comes from in the Quran, and then a little bit about each of the names. And this I find to be an excellent way to bring in a little bit of religion in a very easy, light manner that still has great academic or has a meaningful lesson, but it still doesn't take too much time. I hope you enjoy this look at our opening activities ideas. I hope that you'll check out the blog post that accompanies this video that has all of the details for these different categories of opening activity ideas, as well as links to all of the resources that I shared with you today. You could find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're doing our opening activities on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.